The day they kicked us out of the galaxy, I wore my best jacket. It seemed like the right thing to do for a historic occasion. The chamber of the Interstellar Council was not built for human comfort. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into a pale blue haze. The seats were designed for species with 4 legs, or 6 arms, or bodies that shifted like water in a glass. I sat in a modified chair that had been brought in specifically for the human delegation, which told me everything I needed to know about how they saw us. An afterthought. A species that required special accommodation just to sit in the same room as the rest of the galaxy. I am Mara Voss. At the time, I was Earth's senior delegate to the Galactic Accord, a position I had held for 11 years. I had spent those 11 years learning alien languages, memorizing their political structures, sitting through 4-hour ceremonies that celebrated things I did not fully understand, and smiling through insults so sophisticated that most of my human colleagues did not even realize they were insults. I was very good at my job. On that particular morning, the hall was full. Every species in the Accord had sent representatives. The Veth sat in their suspended water pods, their bioluminescent skin shifting through colors that expressed emotions their mouths could not. The Dothraki stood in a long row at the back, their stone-like forms perfectly still, their 4 eyes fixed forward. The Solari hung from ceiling brackets, their thin bodies wrapped in silk, watching everything with the calm of species that had been alive for 40,000 years. And seated at the elevated curved bench at the front, robed in the deep silver of their office, were the 7 members of the High Council. I had been told the night before, unofficially, by an Accord clerk named Pevin who owed me a favor, that the verdict had already been decided. The deliberation was ceremonial. The outcome was not in question. Still, I wore my best jacket. The Accord speaker was a Solari elder named Orveth. She had been alive longer than human civilization had existed. She spoke slowly, each word placed with the care of someone who understood that language, used correctly, was more powerful than any weapon. The translation came through a small device behind my ear, converting the whistling tonal language of the Solari into plain English a half-second after she spoke. The Galactic Accord, in session for the 490th gathering of its full membership, has reached a conclusion in the matter of the species known as humanity and their seat world, designated Earth. She paused. The entire chamber was silent. Even the Veth had stopped moving. The charges presented before this council are as follows. 1. Unauthorized terraforming of 11 planetary bodies, designated as ecologically protected under the Varan Charter. 2. Unsanctioned first contact with the Miri, a pre-spaceflight civilization on Corridor 9, in direct violation of the non-interference doctrine. 3. Development and distribution of weapons-grade energy systems banned under the Accord's armistice codes, specifically the compressed resonance drives sold to no fewer than 6 independent systems without Accord licensing approval. She kept reading. There were 14 charges in total. I had read them all before. I had, in fact, helped draft the human response to each one, a document that was honest, well-reasoned, and entirely ignored. Around me, the other alien delegates watched with quiet anticipation. A few glanced at me. I kept my expression neutral. After full deliberation, Orveth continued, the High Council finds in favor of the motion submitted by the Dothraki Assembly and co-signed by 32 member species, humanity, and all affiliated human territories, colonies, and vessels are hereby removed from full membership in the Galactic Accord. Trade agreements, hyperspace lane access, diplomatic protections, and all benefits of Accord membership are revoked, effective immediately upon ratification. She set down the scroll. She looked at me directly. I do not know what she expected to see. In addition, she said, the quarantine boundary established around human space will be enforced by Accord patrol vessels. No human ship will be permitted to enter Accord-controlled space without explicit authorization. No Accord member species may trade with, assist, or enter into diplomatic agreements with humanity until such time as this council reviews and revises its position. The chamber was still quiet, but a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes after something irreversible has happened. Orveth extended one long, pale hand toward me, holding the ratification document. It required my signature. Signing it meant Earth accepted the terms. It was, in every technical sense, A surrender. I stood up. I walked to the bench. I took the document. I read it one more time, not because I had missed anything, but because I wanted the room to see that I was reading it calmly. Then I picked up the signing instrument they had provided and wrote my name in the space marked for the human delegate. I handed it back. Then I looked at Orvith, and I asked one question. Does this mean we are no longer bound by the Accord's innovation restriction protocols? She blinked. For a Solari elder who had lived 40,000 years, blinking was a rare event. It meant something had surprised her. The innovation restriction protocols, she said slowly, are binding only upon Accord member species. So that is a yes, I said. I nodded once, thanked her for her time, and walked back to my seat to gather my things. The chamber around me was no longer quiet. The Veth were flashing colors at each other rapidly. The Doraki had shifted, which for a stone-bodied species was the equivalent of jumping from their seats. The Solari on the ceiling were whispering to each other in frequencies too high for my ear device to catch. I picked up my bag. I put on my jacket. I walked to the exit. The heavy doors of the council chamber closed behind me with a deep sound that echoed down the corridor. I stood alone in the hallway for a moment. The floor was polished stone. My reflection looked back at me from below, distorted and stretched. I allowed myself, there in that empty hallway where no one could see, to smile properly. Not because I was not afraid. I was. The truth was that what had just happened was enormous, and frightening, and completely open-ended. No one knew what came next. Earth would be alone in a galaxy it had only just started to understand. But I smiled because of what Orvith had confirmed, perhaps without fully realizing it. For 11 years, the Accord's innovation restriction protocols had functioned as a ceiling above every human engineer, every scientist, every designer and builder and dreamer who wanted to push further than what was permitted. Every time someone on Earth had a new idea, they had to check it against a list of technologies the Accord had banned, licensed exclusively, or placed under review pending approval from committees that moved at the speed of geological change. We had been building with one hand tied behind our backs, and they had just untied it. I walked down the corridor, through the atrium, and out into the pale gold light of the Accord's capital world. My transport back to the human diplomatic vessel was waiting at the landing pad. My assistant, a young man named Colin Marsh who had been with me for 2 years, and was very good at appearing calm when he was not, was standing next to it with a tablet in his hand, and an expression I had never seen on him before. He was not sure if this was the end or the beginning. I took the tablet from him, scanned the outgoing message queue, and handed it back. Send a transmission to the Earth Council, I said. Tell them the vote passed. Tell them we have been formally expelled. And the second part? He asked. Tell them to cancel every pending application we had filed with the Accord's Innovation Review Board. I stepped into the transport. All 47 of them. We will not need their approval anymore. Colin stared at me for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. He pulled up the message and began to type. I looked out the window as the transport lifted off the landing pad. Below me, the Accord's capital city spread out in its ancient, careful, rule-bound beauty. Towers of pale stone that had stood for 10,000 years. Streets laid out by species who believed that order, hierarchy, and consensus were the foundations of a stable galaxy. They had built something impressive, but they had stopped building. That was the thing about the Accord that its members never seemed to understand from the inside. It had been designed to preserve what existed, not to create what did not yet exist. Every rule, every protocol, every restriction, was a wall built to protect something old. And old things, however beautiful, however powerful, however certain of their own importance, had one weakness that no amount of rule writing could fix. They could not imagine what came next. I could. I leaned back in my seat as the transport broke through the clouds, and the sky darkened to black, and the stars came out. Somewhere out there, past the quarantine boundary they were already planning to enforce, was Earth. Was home, was 47 shelved ideas and several hundred more that had never even made it to the filing stage. The galaxy had just told humanity that we were not welcome. What they did not understand, and what I was not going to explain to them, was that we had never actually needed their welcome. We had only ever needed their permission to stop waiting. And now we had it. I looked out at the stars, and I let myself smile again, and this time I did not stop. Colin Marsh had a habit of drinking his tea before it cooled down, and then wincing when it burned him, and then doing the exact same thing the next day. I had watched him do this for 2 years. It was the most human thing about him, and I say that as someone who had spent 11 years surrounded by species that did not drink tea at all. He was doing it now, sitting across from me in the small briefing room aboard the human diplomatic vessel, wince and everything, as I walked him through what would happen in the next 72 hours. The Accord will enforce the quarantine boundary as of local midnight tonight, I said. That means all currently docked human vessels in Accord ports have approximately 6 hours to depart. Our embassy staff across 14 worlds have already received the evacuation notice. Everyone should be out before the deadline. And if someone is not out in time, he asked. They will be escorted out, I said. The Accord will not want the complication of holding human citizens. It is not in their interest. Colin set down his tea. He was 26 years old, 2 advanced degrees, could speak 4 alien languages fluently, and still sometimes looked at me as though he expected an adult to walk in and take over. I did not say this to him because it would not have been kind, but I thought it sometimes. He reminded me of myself at that age, capable, and still not entirely sure whether capability was enough. Delegate Voss, he said carefully, can I ask you something directly? You always can. In the chamber today, when you asked about the innovation restriction protocols, he paused. You knew the answer already, did you not? Yes. So the question was not for information. No. It was for the record, he said slowly. You wanted it confirmed, officially, in front of every species in the Accord, that we were no longer bound by the restrictions. Now it is not a matter of interpretation, I said. Orvith said it herself. The restrictions apply to member species. We are no longer members. If anyone tries to argue otherwise in the future, I have a chamber full of witnesses and a recording with 490 session stamps on it. Colin was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his tea and burned himself again. What are we going to do first? He asked. I had a list. I had been building the list, quietly, for 3 years. Not because I had known the expulsion was coming, but because I had known it was possible, and I believed in being ready for things that were possible. At the top of the list was a project that had been in development for 8 years inside a facility in New Zealand, sitting in a drawer labeled Pending Accord Review, which meant it had never been touched by the review board's cautious hands and never been altered to fit their cautious rules. It was a propulsion system. The engineers who had designed it called it a fold drive, which was not a precise name but was a better name than the technical designation, which was 43 characters long. It did not bend space in the way that Accord hyperspace lanes worked. It did something different, something the Accord's own physicists had decided was theoretically impossible and therefore had never bothered to restrict, which meant we could build it freely. First, I said, we go home. The journey back to Earth took 4 days at standard transit speed. Normally, diplomatic vessels used the Accord's hyperspace lane network, which could have reduced the trip to 8 hours. We no longer had access to the network. We flew the long way. I did not mind. I spent the 4 days in communication with Earth, with the Science Council, with the engineering teams who had been waiting. Word of what had happened spread quickly. By the time we crossed into the outer boundary of the solar system, I had received over 900 messages. Most of them were from scientists and engineers. Most of them said some variation of the same thing. Tell us what we can build. I landed at the New Geneva terminal on a gray afternoon, with low clouds and the smell of rain in the air. The terminal was full of people. Not journalists, not politicians, not the usual crowd that greeted returning diplomatic missions. These were engineers, researchers, and project managers. People who had been sitting on ideas that the Accord had never approved. They had printed a banner. It said, "What took you so long?" I laughed for the first time in days. The weeks that followed were unlike anything in my experience. I had been a diplomat for my entire career. My world was words, protocols, careful language, and patience measured in years. What happened after the expulsion was the opposite of everything I knew. It was fast, it was loud, it was chaotic, in the way that things are chaotic, when a tremendous amount of energy that has been carefully contained is suddenly free. The fold drive project came out of its drawer first. The New Zealand team had been working on it in theory for 8 years and had built a scaled prototype in secret 3 years before, never activating it because activation would have violated the Accord's unauthorized propulsion testing rules. They activated it on a Tuesday. It worked. Not perfectly, but it worked, which is the only way anything important ever works for the first time. Within 6 months, a full-scale version was installed in a repurposed survey vessel named the Aldwin. The test flight took the ship across 40 light-years in 11 minutes. The pilot, a woman named Petra Hollis who had been flying deep space survey missions for a decade and had the calm voice of someone who did not believe in being surprised, radioed back a report that said, "Distance confirmed, time confirmed, systems nominal, ready to go again." I read that report 3 times in a row. The terraforming teams came second. Under Accord rules, we had only been permitted to terraform worlds that met a specific set of criteria for ecological inactivity. A list so narrow that in 11 years we had terraformed exactly 2 planets. Without the restrictions, the teams went to work on a list of worlds they had been watching for years. Not empty, dead rocks. Living worlds with complex chemistry, interesting geology, the kind of places that would take generations to fully understand, and would reward every generation that tried. 11 new colonies in the first year alone. The Accord patrol vessels appeared at the quarantine boundary on schedule. 12 ships, spread across the main approach corridors into human space. They were large, well-armed, and crewed by species that took their instructions very seriously. Their job was to prevent human expansion and to send a message, "You are contained." They watched us terraform 11 worlds. They filed reports. Their reports made their way back to the Council. The Council convened emergency sessions. I know this because Pevin, the Accord clerk who had warned me about the verdict, sent me short messages every few weeks from an encrypted terminal. He was, in his quiet way, one of the most useful people I had ever known. The Council's emergency sessions, according to Pevin, were not going well. The members who had voted for the expulsion had expected a period of contraction, a species cut off from trade, from travel lanes, from diplomatic protection, was supposed to shrink, was supposed to struggle, was supposed to come back, eventually, asking to be let back in on whatever terms the Council chose to offer. They had not planned for the alternative. Meanwhile, something else was happening along the quarantine boundary that the Accord had not anticipated. The boundary was a line in space, marked by patrol ships and sensor buoys. On the Accord side of the line, ships passed normally. Trade went on. Species went about their business under the rules they had always followed. But some of those species had been following those rules unhappily for a long time. The first contact came from a species called the Thari. They were a mid-tier Accord member, small fleet, modest territory, technically advanced but economically squeezed by trade agreements that consistently favored the larger, older member species. A Thari merchant vessel showed up at the quarantine boundary one morning and broadcast, on an open channel, a question. Was Earth accepting trade inquiries? I happened to be awake when the message came in. It was 3 in the morning, Geneva time. I was sitting in my home office because I did not sleep well anymore, and had stopped pretending otherwise. I read the message. I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then I sent back a reply. Earth was absolutely accepting trade inquiries. The Thari captain's name was Sel, and she was not exactly a rebel. She was a business person who had looked at the Accord's trade pricing, looked at what human manufacturing was starting to produce without restriction, and decided that opportunity was more interesting than rule following. She brought her ship across the boundary with a cargo hold full of rare mineral compounds the Accord had always licensed exclusively through one particular species at inflated prices. She wanted full drive schematics in return. We made the trade. Sel went back across the boundary. Then she came back 3 weeks later with 2 other ships. Then those ships told their contacts. The pattern was quiet at first. Not a flood, but a trickle. The kind of movement that does not show up in official records because it is conducted carefully by people who have done the math and do not want to file the paperwork. Within 8 months, 47 distinct species had made informal trade contact with human space. None of them had officially left the Accord. They were not stupid. Open defection carried consequences, but the quarantine boundary, it turned out, worked in both directions. The Accord patrol ships could watch for human vessels crossing outward. They were less equipped to monitor every Accord member vessel that passed near the boundary and conducted a brief, undocumented exchange. I read Pevin's messages about the Council's emergency sessions and thought about trickles becoming rivers. Colin, who had been promoted to deputy director of the new Department of External Relations we had set up to replace the Accord embassy apparatus, knocked on my office door one evening about 14 months after the expulsion. "You have a moment?" he said. "Always." He sat down. He did not have his tea with him, which meant this was not a casual conversation. "I have been compiling numbers from the boundary trade records," he said. "Unofficial exchanges, the undocumented contacts, the supply runs that technically do not appear in any Accord ledger. And," he laid a data tablet on my desk, "47 species, 312 separate exchanges. The estimated total value of goods transferred in the last 14 months is greater than Earth's total trade volume under the Accord in the last 3 years." I picked up the tablet and looked at the numbers. They were good numbers. "There is something else," Colin said. He did not reach for a teacup, which confirmed my suspicion that this was the serious part. 7 of those 47 species have made informal inquiries that go beyond trade. They are asking about membership, not in the Accord, in something else. He let the words settle. I set the tablet down. "Something else," I said. "They have used a few different terms. Alliance, compact, agreement. One Theri official used the phrase, an arrangement with fewer ceilings." I sat back in my chair. Outside the window, the lights of New Geneva spread across the valley below. Somewhere above the cloud cover, the stars were doing what they always did, indifferent to the politics of the small, warm creatures below. "Tell them we are interested," I said, "but we do not move quickly on structural agreements. We do this carefully." Colin nodded. He stood to leave. "Colin," I said. He stopped. "Get yourself a better teacup, one with a lid. Maybe you will stop burning yourself." He smiled, which was rare enough to be worth noticing, and left. I turned back to the window. 14 months. 11 new colonies. A fold drive that worked. 47 species finding their way quietly to our door. The Council's emergency sessions growing longer and louder. The quarantine was not working the way they had intended. I had known it would not. Not because I am clever, though I hope I am, but because the Accord had made a fundamental error in its understanding of what the quarantine was designed to contain. It was meant to contain humanity. But what it had actually done was remove every reason we had to stay small. The galaxy was watching, and I was just getting started. The Admiral's name was Verith Solan, and he had commanded Accord enforcement vessels for 30 years without incident, which meant he was very experienced, and also that he had never actually been in a situation that required more than a raised voice and a bureaucratic form. I knew this when I flew out to meet him. The meeting point was a position in deep space, equidistant from the quarantine boundary, and the nearest Accord patrol station, chosen specifically because it belonged, legally, to no one. Neutral ground, in the truest sense. No gravity well in range. Just a patch of dark with stars in every direction. My ship was not what he expected. I watched his sensor readings through Colin's real-time relay, and I watched the moment his crew registered what they were looking at. The Accord had records of every human vessel that had existed at the time of the expulsion. They had detailed specifications, crew capacity, drive signatures, everything. They used those records to track us. They were thorough about it. The ship I arrived in was not in any of those records. It could not be, because it had not existed at the time of the expulsion. It had been built in the last 2 years in an orbital facility above Mars that the Accord patrol ships could see from the boundary, but could not enter to inspect. The ship was called the Aldwin class, which meant it was the 4th of its type, and it was built around a fold drive that the Accord's physicists had told themselves was impossible. Their sensors found the ship. Their computers tried to classify it. They failed. Varath Solan, to his credit, did not panic. He opened a channel. "Delegate Voss," he said. His voice was calm, professional. The Doraki spoke in a deep, resonant tone that always sounded like someone addressing a crowd, even in private conversation. I was informed this would be a diplomatic exchange between your vessel and my flagship. I was not informed there would be additional vessels. Hello, Admiral, I said. Thank you for meeting me. The additional vessels, he said again. I had been waiting for this moment for 6 months. Not because I had planned for it to be dramatic, although it was, but because it was the clearest possible way to make a point that words alone could not make as well. I transmitted the coordinates. 17 ships decloaked. They appeared around my vessel in a loose formation, arranged not for aggression, but for visibility. They were large, every one of them, and they carried the identification markings of 7 different species, all of them Accord members, all of them people who had, over the last 2 years, quietly decided that their interests aligned more closely with the Freehold Compact than with the organization they were still nominally members of. The Thari captain's cell was there. So was a Veth Deep Current commander named Olari, who had contacted us 8 months ago after her shipping routes were rerouted by an Accord trade ruling that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with a long-standing political favor between 2 larger species. So was a representative of the Miri, the pre-spaceflight civilization that the Accord had charged us with making unauthorized contact with, who were, as it turned out, perfectly happy to have been contacted, and now had 2 fully operational space stations and a growing trade relationship with Earth. Verath Solon did not respond for 19 seconds. I counted. This is unexpected, he said. I imagine it is. These vessels are registered Accord members. They are, I agreed. Acting in a personal capacity, outside Accord patrol jurisdiction, in neutral space, for the purpose of attending a diplomatic exchange to which they have been invited. I do not believe any of that violates Accord regulations, but you would know better than I would, given that I am no longer a member. Another pause. Shorter this time. You said you had a proposal, he said. I do. I had prepared the proposal carefully, not in the combative language of a species that wanted to win an argument, but in the language of someone who had identified a problem and was offering to help fix it. The problem, as I framed it, was not the quarantine. It was not the Accord's authority. It was structural. The Accord's current model was creating friction it could not absorb. Trade was leaking around the boundary in ways the Council could not stop without enforcing regulations so aggressively that it would damage its own member relationships. The quarantine was costing them more than it was costing us. What I offered was a framework for coexistence, not reintegration, not submission, not a return to the relationship we had before, something new. A parallel structure, the Freehold Compact, operating under its own charter, maintaining its own borders, but willing to negotiate terms of mutual recognition with the Accord. 2 systems, separate, cooperative where it suited both, independent where it did not. Verath Solon listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. This proposal, he said at last, is beyond my authority to accept or decline. It would require the Council's full consideration. I know, I said. I am not asking you to accept it. I am asking you to carry it back to them. And the vessels behind you, he said, are they intended to be part of the proposal, or a statement alongside it? I thought about that for a moment. Both, I said. He made a sound that might have been a Doraki laugh. It was difficult to be certain. I will carry your proposal to the Council, he said. I will recommend they take it seriously. I appreciate that. Delegate Voss, he said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not official anymore. Just one experienced person to another. When you signed the ratification in the Council chamber 2 years ago, I was watching through the broadcast feed. You asked about the restrictions. I remember. At the time, he said, most of the chamber believed it was a strange question, possibly a desperate one. A person grasping for something to hold on to. And now? I asked. Now, he said. I think it was the most important question asked in that chamber in 50 years. He closed the channel. His flagship began its turn back toward Accord space. I sat in my seat for a moment, watching the 17 ships around me hold their positions, waiting for a signal from me. Behind us, across the boundary, the Accord's patrol ships were still watching. Above us, below us, in every direction, the galaxy was doing what it always did. I pressed the channel open to the formation. Thank you all, I said. Stand down and return to your own courses. We will be in contact. The ships acknowledged and began to disperse. The Aldwin-class vessel I was on fell into its own heading, and I let Colin take the navigation while I sat in the observation bay and looked at the stars. The council would take the proposal back to their chambers. They would debate it. Some of them would reject it outright, because some of them still believed the quarantine could hold if they simply enforced it harder. They would not understand, not yet, that enforcement was not the problem. The problem was that the galaxy they had built was no longer the only option available to the species inside it. We had given those species a door, and doors, once people know they exist, are very difficult to pretend are not there. Colin appeared in the doorway of the observation bay. The council is requesting a formal response timeline, he said. They want to know when we expect to hear back regarding the proposal. Tell them we are patient, I said, but not indefinitely. He wrote it down. Colin, I said. Yes? The 17 captains who came today. I want formal recognition documents prepared for each of them. Not membership papers, not treaty documents. Just something that says clearly, we see them. We know what today cost them in terms of the risk they took, and we will not forget it. He looked up from his notes. That is not standard diplomatic practice, he said. No, I said. It is not. He wrote it down anyway, which was one of the things I liked best about him. I turned back to the window. The boundary was behind us now. The stars ahead were the stars of human space, dotted here and there with new light from the 11 colonies, from the orbital stations, from the ships that had been built in the years since the expulsion, in numbers, and with technologies that no one on the other side of that boundary had expected us to be capable of. We were not the species they had expelled 2 years ago. We had not been standing still. And we were not finished. The first message came in at 4 in the morning, which was becoming a pattern I had come to accept about my life. Colin sent it to my personal screen rather than waking me with the alarm channel, which was his way of telling me it was serious, but not immediately critical. I read it twice before getting up to make tea. The colony was called Kurhan Station. It had been established 14 months ago on a moon orbiting a gas giant in what the Accord's old charts had labeled as strategically sensitive space, which was their way of saying they wanted it, but had not gotten around to claiming it properly. We had gotten around to it. Kurhan Station had a population of about 2,200 people, mostly engineers and geologists, and a contingent of agricultural specialists who were working on whether the moon's surface chemistry could be adjusted to support long-term food production. It was not a military installation. It had no significant defensive infrastructure. It was exactly the kind of colony that had no reason to be a target. The attack happened in the night cycle of the station's local time. Something hit the main habitat ring. The automated emergency systems transmitted for approximately 4 minutes before going offline. After that, silence. I was in the emergency briefing room within 15 minutes. Colin was already there, along with the directors of the Defense Council, the Science Council, and a woman named Harriet Oakes, who ran the Freehold Compact's intelligence division, with the organized quiet of someone who had long ago made peace with knowing things other people preferred not to know. What do we have? I said. Partial sensor data from the outer beacon, Harriet said. She projected it onto the main screen. The image was fragmentary but readable. A vessel, approaching from the far side of the gas giant, not broadcasting any identification. A single discharge of directed energy striking the main habitat ring at a point consistent with the junction between the ring's structural support and its environmental control layer. A catastrophic decompression event. Then the vessel had gone. Ship classification? I asked. Not Accord standard, said the defense director, a man named Glenn Farrow, who had been a naval officer before joining the Compact administration and still stood like someone who expected an inspection at any moment. Too large for a scout, too small for a patrol cruiser. Vrive's signature is unlike anything in our registry. Casualty count? Unknown. The emergency extraction teams are en route. Earliest arrival is 6 hours. I sat down. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the night lights of New Geneva spread across the valley, and above them, the sky was beginning to pale toward morning. What is the preliminary read? I said to Harriet. She looked at her data screen for a moment before answering. There are two obvious candidates. 1. A faction within the Accord has decided that letting the proposal sit in committee is too slow and is attempting to destabilize the compact directly. 2. An independent actor who benefits from conflict between us and the Accord and wants to provoke a response that looks like an Accord action. A false flag, Glenn said. It is a possibility I would not discard, Harriet said. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the partial sensor image on the screen. An unidentified ship, an attack on an undefended civilian station, timed, conveniently, to land in my briefing room at 4 in the morning, while Vareth Solin's proposal report was still sitting in the council's inbox. It was too convenient. That did not mean it was not real. People who plan things carefully sometimes create convenience on purpose. Glenn, I said, I want defensive protocols raised around all colonies and stations, but with no change to the patrol disposition near the boundary, no aggressive movement, nothing that looks like we are preparing a response action. Understood. Harriet, I want every data fragment from Kurhan Station pulled and analyzed. The weapon signature specifically. I want to know what fired that shot, and I want to know with evidence, not with probability estimates. She nodded. I was already planning that. And someone tell me, the moment the extraction teams arrive, and we have a preliminary casualty count. I stood up. The meeting ended. People moved back to their stations. I walked to the window and stood there with my tea, which had gone cold without my noticing. Kurhan Station had 2,200 people. Engineers, geologists, agricultural specialists, people who had volunteered to go to a new world on a new moon and build something from nothing, which was the most human thing in the universe. I did not know any of them by name, but that did not matter. They were mine to protect. Every person in every colony and station we had built was mine to protect, and I had failed at that in a way that could not be undone, because whatever had happened in the night cycle at Kurhan Station had already happened, and I had been asleep. I did not say this to anyone in the room. It would not have helped anyone, and it would not have changed the facts. What I did instead was what I had always done. I picked up the data, and I started working through it. Harriet had the weapon signature analysis completed in 48 hours, which was fast. She brought it to me personally, rather than sending it through the system, which told me the result was sensitive. She set a data chip on my desk. The weapon that hit Kurhan Station, she said, was a compressed resonance emitter. I looked at her. That is one of the weapons categories that was listed in our charges before the council, I said slowly. Yes, she said. It is also a weapon that appears in our own weapons development records as having been derived from Accord standard technology. So it could be us. In terms of the weapon type, yes. In terms of the specific signature, no. She tapped the data chip. The emitter that fired on Kurhan Station used a power modulation pattern consistent with an older generation of the technology, before our modifications. It is, functionally, an Accord standard resonance emitter. Fired by a ship that was not in our registry, and not in any Accord classification either, I said. Correct. We sat with that for a moment. Someone in the Accord, I said, or someone with access to Accord standard weapons, who wants us to believe it was the Accord. Or someone in the Accord who is freelancing, Harriet said, and using unofficial assets so that when the council asks if they ordered it, they can say honestly that they did not. That was the most uncomfortable possibility, and also the most likely one. Political systems with multiple factions under pressure sometimes produce actors who believe they are doing what the whole organization wants, just faster than the organization is willing to officially move. I need to know which member species benefits most from our failure, I said. I have a preliminary list, she said, and I need to know if we have an asset anywhere near the Council's internal communications. She did not say anything for a moment. Harriet, I said. There are channels I can access, she said carefully. They are not official channels. If it becomes known that we used them, the diplomatic consequences could be significant. Use them, I said, and manage the consequences later. She picked up the data chip and left. I sat alone for a while. Then I called for Colin. He came in with tea, 2 cups this time, both with lids. He had taken my suggestion, finally. I need to make a public broadcast, I said. He sat down. About Cairhan Station. About Cairhan Station. About what we know, what we do not know, and how we are responding. I took the tea. Broadcast it to everyone. Accord space, boundary zones, compact members, independent systems, everyone who has a receiver. I want the entire galaxy to know what happened at Cairhan, what we found, and that we are investigating. He was quiet for a moment. That is a large move. Yes. If the Accord is behind it, broadcasting the evidence puts them in a position where they have to either explain themselves publicly or be seen doing nothing. Correct. And if it was a rogue faction acting without the Council's knowledge, broadcasting the evidence forces the Council to investigate internally and removes their option to quietly ignore it. Also correct. He wrote something on his tablet, and if the broadcast causes the guilty party to panic and move quickly, we might draw them out. That too, I said. It is a useful broadcast in several directions at once. He looked at me. You are doing several things at the same time again. I am always doing several things at the same time, I said. It is called being organized. He almost smiled. He started writing the broadcast draft. I sat back and thought about Yaren. Yaren was a Veth deep ocean ecologist who had been part of the first official compact diplomatic exchange. She had come to Earth 9 months ago as part of a cultural mission, one of the first formal interspecies exchanges we had conducted under compact terms rather than accord terms. She was small, even by Veth standards, with bioluminescent patches along her forearms that shifted color constantly when she was thinking, which meant they were almost always moving. She had spent 3 days at a marine research station in Iceland, where the researchers had nearly lost their minds with excitement at the biological data she carried, simply by existing in the water alongside them. She had gone home and sent me a message that said simply, "Your oceans are extraordinary." I said thank you. She said, "No, I mean it. I have been to 14 worlds. None of them have oceans like yours. You should protect them better." I had written that down. I had it still. 4 days after the Cairhan attack, while the extraction teams were still working through the wreckage and Harriet was working her channels, and Colin was drafting the broadcast, a second attack occurred. This one was not at a colony. It was at a transport vessel en route from Earth to the Aldwin orbital station, carrying personnel and supplies. A fast, small ship came out of nowhere, fired a single shot at the transport's navigation systems, and vanished before the escort vessel could respond. The transport survived, limping to the nearest safe harbor with a damaged drive. No one died. But the message was clear. Someone was not trying to destroy us. Someone was trying to scare us. I did not release that information immediately. I sat on it for 12 hours while Harriet's channels started producing results. At the end of those 12 hours, Harriet sat down across from me and put a single name on my desk. Not a species name, an individual, a council-level official within one of the Accord's founding member species, the Doraki, a species whose homeworld sat at the center of the most traveled trade routes in the Accord's network, a species whose entire economic model depended on controlling the flow of traffic through their space, a species whose position became significantly less important the moment the Freehold Compact established its own transit infrastructure and other species began to use it. The official had not fired the weapons himself. He had commissioned them through a chain of contacts that ended with a small mercenary operation that had access to surplus Accord military equipment. He had done it without the Council's knowledge. He had done it because he had calculated that a successful attack on a human colony, followed by a hasty and angry human response against the Accord, would derail the compact negotiations and restore the status quo. He had been wrong about the response. He had not known about Harriet. I looked at the name for a long time. Then I authorized the broadcast, all of it, the weapon signature analysis, the evidence linking the attack to Accord standard equipment, the preliminary findings from Harriet's investigation, and one additional element, a formal request for the Council to conduct an independent inquiry into the attacks and to provide their own findings within 30 standard days. I did not name the official. I did not need to. The Council would find him on their own once they started looking, because the evidence pointed clearly enough that anyone looking honestly would arrive at the same place. If they refused to look, that was its own kind of answer. and the galaxy would draw its own conclusions. The broadcast went out. Responses started coming in within hours. And then Colin came to my office. It was evening. The city lights were on. He stood in the doorway and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, the particular stillness of someone carrying news they do not want to deliver. "Harriet is on the channel," he said. "She says she needs to speak with you directly." I picked up the channel. Harriet's voice was measured, controlled in the way that voices are controlled when the speaker is working hard to keep them that way. "The extraction teams finished their work at Cairhan Station 2 hours ago," she said. "I have the final casualty figures. Tell me." She told me. I set the channel down when she was done. I sat in my chair. Colin stood in the doorway and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Cairhan Station had 2,200 people. We had recovered 409 alive. The rest were gone. The atmospheric breach had been catastrophic and rapid, and the emergency systems that might have sealed individual sections had been targeted specifically in the initial strike. Whoever planned the attack had known exactly where to hit to maximize the loss. This was not a warning. This was not a statement. This was something much more deliberate, and the person responsible was a name on a piece of paper in Harriet's file, and the council had 30 days to find him. I sat in my chair for a long time. I did not smile. I did not find anything to feel good about. I looked at the window and the lights of the city, and I thought about a marine research station in Iceland, and bioluminescent patches on small arms that shifted when their owner was thinking, and a message that said, "Your oceans are extraordinary." Yaren had been on the transport vessel that was struck in the second attack. She had survived, along with everyone else on that ship. She had sent me a message when they reached safe harbor. It said, "I am all right. I hope you are too." She was not all right. She was shaken, and I knew because Olari, the Veth commander who had been at the neutral space meeting, told me so in a side-channel message the following day. Yaren was questioning whether the compact was safe for non-human species, whether allying with humanity brought more risk than benefit, whether the thing she had believed in, which was that connections between species built through honest contact and fair dealing were stronger than connections built through hierarchy and controlled access, was actually true. She was not wrong to ask those questions. They were the right questions. I did not have clean answers to them. What I had was the evidence, the broadcast, the 30-day clock I had set for the council, and the name on Harriet's piece of paper. I had the knowledge that truth, distributed widely and persistently, eventually becomes impossible to ignore. And I had the list of 409 people who had made it out of Cairhan Station alive, which I asked for and received and read in full, every name, because they deserved that much. I put the list away when I was done. Then I got back to work. The summit was Yaren's idea. She had recovered, eventually, from the transport incident. I do not use that word lightly, recovered, because what she went through was not a thing that passes quickly. She went back to her homeworld for 2 months. She spent time in the deep ocean, which is where Veth go when they need to think, because the ocean there is dark and old and not interested in anyone's politics. She came back. When she transmitted a message asking to speak with me directly, I answered within 10 minutes. The idea she proposed was simple and enormous at the same time. She suggested that the next formal step for the Freehold Compact should not be another negotiation, not another show of strength, not another broadcast. It should be a gathering, open to every species in the galaxy, Compact member or not, Accord member or not, independent or dependent, or anything in between. A place where anyone who wanted to could come and speak. No agenda imposed from above. No outcome decided in advance. A chance for the galaxy to sit in one room and talk about what it actually wanted, rather than what the existing structures had told it was possible. Where? I asked. Somewhere new, she said. Somewhere that does not belong to either side. Somewhere built for this. I thought about it for a long time, long enough that the silence on the channel became unusual. We would need to build it, I said. Yes, she said. I know. I looked at Colin, who was sitting across from me, and had heard every word. He raised his eyebrows, which was his way of saying that this was either the best idea he had heard in years, or an enormous amount of work, and probably both. All right, I said. We built it in orbit above Earth. Not because we wanted to be arrogant about it. There were strategic reasons, practical reasons, logistical reasons. Earth had the largest civilian construction capacity in the compact. Earth was the reason the compact existed, and there was a symbolism to it that I did not try to deny. The species that had been told it was not welcome in the galaxy was inviting the galaxy to come to it. The station took 14 months to build. It was designed by a team that included human engineers, Thari structural specialists, a Veth environmental systems expert who worked specifically on the atmospheric sections that needed to support oxygen breathers and non-oxygen breathers in the same building, and a Solari architect whose work was funded personally by a private individual, whose name I was never given, but whose contribution I suspected came from someone who had voted in the council chamber 2 years before the expulsion, and had been reconsidering it ever since. The station was named for Yaren's suggestion that it be a place without a ceiling. The formal name, agreed on by the founding members of the compact, was the Open Charter Station. Everyone who worked there called it what it was, a place to talk. I called it Yaren Station. I told her this when the naming document was signed. She was quiet for a moment. Her bioluminescent patches, visible through the video channel, moved slowly. When she spoke, she said, "That is too much." "It is not enough," I said, "but it is what we have." The Accord received the summit invitation 3 months before the opening date. It was sent to every member of the High Council, every species with an Accord seat, and publicly broadcast to every independent system with a receiver. The invitation was simple. It said, "Come. No preconditions, no agenda assigned in advance. Just come and talk." The council convened an emergency session about the invitation. Peven sent me notes, as he always did, though his messages had become less frequent since the Kerhan investigation had forced a large internal review of Accord communications. The war faction was arguing against attendance. Attending the summit, they said, legitimized the compact. It implied equality between the two structures. It was a concession they could not afford to make. The moderates, who had been gaining ground since the Kerhan evidence was broadcast and the investigation had quietly confirmed what Harriet's channels had already told us, argued the opposite. Refusing to attend was a public declaration of inflexibility. The galaxy was watching. If the Accord sat out the most significant diplomatic gathering since its own founding, the message it sent to every independent species, every undecided member, every species quietly trading across the boundary, was that the Accord did not want dialogue, it wanted control. And control, as the last several years had demonstrated with some clarity, was no longer a thing the Accord was capable of exercising over the galaxy it thought it governed. The war faction argued for another 3 weeks, and then went quiet, which Peven's notes suggested meant not that they had been persuaded, but that they had lost the vote. The council sent its delegation. 38 species attended the first session of the summit. 7 of them were Accord members who had not previously had any contact with the compact. 12 were species I had never heard of. Independent systems from the outer reaches of the galaxy who had no formal affiliation with anyone, and had come because an open invitation was something new, and new things attracted people who had been waiting for something different. The Doraki official whose name appeared on Harriet's piece of paper did not attend. He had been identified by the council's internal investigation, quietly removed from his position, and was no longer involved in council affairs. His name was never made public by either side. I had agreed to that as a condition of the council's cooperation with the investigation. It was a concession I made reluctantly and for specific reasons. I did not want the Doraki species as a whole to become associated with what one member of their council delegation had done. Individuals make decisions. Species are not their worst actors. I had written that principle into the compact charter on the first day. The summit lasted 5 days. On the first day, there were 7 separate arguments before mid-morning and a near breakdown in the second-tier session over atmospheric standards in the shared dining hall. By the 3rd day, the arguments had become negotiations. By the 5th day, 41 species had signed what we called the opening statement of the Yaren Charter, which was not a treaty and not a membership agreement. It was a declaration, a statement that all species signing it believed in the right of any civilization to exist without requiring permission from any other civilization for the shape of its development. It was the most radical thing anyone had put their signature to in this part of the galaxy in several thousand years, and it was signed in a room above Earth, in a station built by species who had been enemies, allies, neutrals, and everything in between, and it said, simply, and with no asterisks, and no fine print, and no licensing requirements, "We choose to be here." 3 Accord member species submitted formal departure notices from the Accord within the month following the summit. They were the first, and they were not the last. The Accord did not collapse quickly. I want to be honest about that, because a dramatic collapse would make a better story, but it would not be a true one. What happened was slower and less cinematic. The Accord lost members one at a time, over 2 years, as species calculated their interests and concluded that the structure that had served them for millennia no longer served them as well as the alternative. Some of them left quietly, with formal notices and transition agreements. Some of them left noisily, with public statements and grievances aired over open channels. Some of them did not leave at all. They simply stopped attending sessions, stopped paying dues, stopped abiding by rulings, until the Accord was less an organization and more a habit that some species had not gotten around to breaking yet. The War faction dissolved as a political force. Its members did not vanish. They went back to their home systems and continued to represent the interests of their species, as they had always done, but without the power to direct an enforcement fleet, or block a trade agreement, or quarantine a world. Power that is not exercised eventually stops being power. Orvith, the Solari elder who had read the expulsion decree in the council chamber, sent me a private communication 18 months after the summit. She was very old. She had been alive for 40,000 years, and she communicated with the slowness of someone for whom time had a different texture. Her message was short. She said, "I underestimated you. I do not often say that." I wrote back immediately. I said, "You gave us exactly what we needed. I am not certain you knew that, but it is true. I would not take back a word of it." She responded, "Neither would I. Not anymore." That was the end of our correspondence. I kept it. The last session of the Galactic Accord was held 14 months after the Yaren Charter Summit. It was attended by 9 species, down from the original 312. The session lasted 40 minutes. The Accord speaker, a replacement for Orvith who had stepped back from official duties, read a formal statement of suspension of regular operations. Not a dissolution, not an admission of failure, a suspension, carefully worded, leaving theoretical room for reconvening. Political organizations rarely announce their own endings cleanly. They prefer to leave a door open. There was no one left to walk back through it. I watched the broadcast of the final session from Yaren Station, where I had taken up something between permanent residence and occasional office. Colin was with me, and Harriet, and Glenn Farrow, and Petra Hollis, the fold drive pilot who had come back from 40 light years in 11 minutes, and never seemed particularly impressed by any of it. Olari was there, the Veth commander. Sel was there, the Thari captain who had brought her cargo ship across the boundary in the early days, and asked us if we were interested in a trade. There were others, a room full of people who had been part of something without necessarily knowing, at the time, how large that something would become. We watched the broadcast. When it ended, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Sel said something in Thari that her translator rendered as, "That took longer than I expected." And someone else laughed, and then several people were laughing, and the quiet broke apart the way quiet does when it is ready to be finished. Colin came to stand beside me. He was holding a cup with a lid on it, as he had been doing for almost 2 years now. He had not burned himself in a very long time. "The new delegate from the outer systems arrives tomorrow," he said. "The one from the Corridor 9 Miri group." "I know," I said. "I have their briefing file." "They sent a message along with the confirmation," he said. It was short. "What did it say?" He looked at his tablet. It said, "We have been told you made first contact with us once, in a way that others considered improper. We would like to make contact properly now. We have questions." I looked at him. "Tell them we have answers," I said, "and questions of our own, and that we are very glad they are coming." He sent the reply and put his tablet away. I walked to the viewport of Yaren Station. The curve of Earth was visible below, blue and white and green, impossibly beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you have been away from them and returned. Somewhere down there, in a valley full of city lights, was the office where I had spent the years after the expulsion doing things that the galaxy had told me were not possible. Somewhere further out, past the orbital ring, the fold drive ships moved along routes we had charted ourselves, to worlds we had chosen ourselves, at speeds that the Accord's physicists had told themselves could not exist. Above us, further than visible range, in the spaces between stars, the galaxy was doing what it always did, being vast, and old, and full of things that had not yet been found. Below me, a young attaché whose name I was still learning knocked on the frame of the viewport alcove. "Delegate Voss," she said. She was perhaps 23, earnest, carrying a tablet with the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty that I remembered from Colin at that age, and from myself before him. "I have been reading the archive of the expulsion session, the chamber broadcast." "I know the one," I said. "At the end," she said, "when you signed the document and asked about the restrictions, everyone could see that you were calm, that you were not afraid." She paused. "Were you?" I looked at her for a moment. She was asking a real question. She deserved a real answer. "Yes," I said. "I was frightened. It was an enormous thing that had just happened, and I did not know exactly what would come next. No one did." "Then why did you smile?" I looked back at the viewport, at Earth below, at the stars beyond. "Because I knew us," I said, "not what we would do specifically, not which technologies or which colonies or which alliances. I did not know any of that. But I knew that the worst thing you can tell a human being is that they are not allowed to do something. We have never, in all our long and chaotic history, taken that well." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about it. "And the Accord did not know that?" she asked. "They knew it," I said. "They simply believed the rule was stronger than the person it was meant to hold back." She nodded slowly. Then she smiled, a small, careful smile, the beginning of something she would grow into. "Good night, Delegate Voss," she said, and left. I turned back to the window. Earth turned slowly below me in the dark. The station hummed around me with the quiet life of a place full of people doing work that mattered. Somewhere down the corridor, Colin and the others were still talking, and the voices carried faintly through the walls, warm and ordinary and real. The galaxy had told us we were not welcome. We had thanked them, politely, for the freedom, and then we had come back to stay.